Ethan Caldwell didn't even have the decency to lower his voice. He stood in the middle of Harlan Street with his hat pushed back and his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, and he said it loud enough for the barber, the blacksmith, and every idling soul on that Tuesday afternoon to hear every word. "I don't know what kind of arrangement you think we had, but I'm not in the business of taking in strays." The stagecoach was still rocking on its axles behind her. Clara Whitmore had one bag at her feet and 6 months of letters folded against her chest, and she stood there in the Montana dust while a man she had never met in person told her she was a mistake. Not a person, not a woman, not even a disappointment worth the courtesy of a quiet conversation. A mistake. Something to be corrected and moved past. The worst part was the silence that followed. Not the silence of sympathy, the silence of people deciding whether to feel sorry for her or relieved it wasn't them. If you've ever been told your worth out loud, in public, by someone who never knew you, stay with this story. Because what Clara did next is the reason I'm telling it. If this is your first time finding this channel, subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Press the like button if this story already has your attention. And drop a comment with your city and country, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that street in Montana, 1883, and watch what happens when a woman with nothing decides that nothing is exactly enough to start with. The stagecoach from Billings arrived in Carver's Crossing at 2:30 on a Wednesday in late September, and it was running 40 minutes behind schedule because one of the rear wheels had thrown a pin somewhere outside of Laurel, and the driver had spent the better part of an hour in the weeds with a wrench and a vocabulary that Clara Whitmore had done her best not to absorb. She was the only passenger who got off in Carver's Crossing. The other two, a land surveyor from Ohio and a woman visiting her daughter in Great Falls, had watched her gather her bag from the overhead rack with the careful attention of people who had nothing better to do for the last 6 hours than observe. Clara had not talked much during the ride. She'd answered questions politely and then turned back to the window, watching the land open up into something vast and indifferent, nothing like the dense, pressed-together streets of Philadelphia, where you could always hear your neighbor's argument through the wall. She was 26 years old. She had $63 in a cloth envelope sewn into the lining of her bag. She had a needle case, 2 dresses, a pair of boots that had been resoled twice, and a small bundle of letters tied with a piece of twine she'd saved from a package of dress fabric. Those letters were from Ethan Caldwell, rancher, Carver's Crossing, Montana Territory. 12 letters over 6 months, each one written in a steady, deliberate hand that had struck her when she first read them, as the hand of a man who chose his words carefully. She had chosen her words carefully, too. She had told him she was a skilled seamstress with experience managing a household. She had told him she was practical, in good health, unafraid of hard work. She had told him she had no family left in Philadelphia, which was true, and that she was ready to commit to a new life in the West, which was also true. She had not told him that the reason she had no family and no money and no fixed address was that her mother had died the previous winter and the creditors had arrived before the body was cold, and the shop her mother had run for 22 years, the modest seamstress's shop on Locust Street that had kept them both alive since Clara was 4 years old, had been claimed against a debt Clara hadn't even known existed until a man in a gray coat showed her the paperwork and told her she had 30 days. She hadn't told him that because it wasn't the kind of thing you put in a letter to a stranger. You didn't lead with everything you'd lost. You led with what you still had, and what you still had was the ability to work and the determination to keep going, and she'd told him those things, and they were real. She'd thought they were enough. Ethan Caldwell was waiting near the post office, which also served as the stagecoach depot. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that wasn't flashy but communicated money without needing to announce it. Good wool coat, clean boots, a watch chain that caught the light when he moved. He was perhaps 40, or close enough to it. His hair was dark at the temples, going gray, and he had the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set against something difficult and never quite relaxed since. Clara recognized him from the photograph he'd sent, or thought she did. The photograph had been formal, stiff, the way photographs always were, and she'd spent enough time studying it that she'd built a whole person around it in her mind. A fair person, a steady person. Someone who had written to her about the land and about winter and about the way the light came off the mountains in the morning with a kind of plain wonder that she had found genuinely moving. She raised her hand. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not warmly. He walked toward her, and she noticed he did not hurry, and she noticed he did not smile, and she noticed the way his eyes moved from her face to her bag and back again, calculating something. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell." She extended her hand and he shook it once, briefly. "It's good to finally—" "How much did you bring with you?" She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Money." His voice was flat. Not cruel yet, just businesslike, in a way that didn't fit the moment. "Your family resources. I asked in my 4th letter about your financial situation, and you said you were in a position to invest in the arrangement." She had not said that. She remembered the 4th letter clearly. He had asked, obliquely, about her family circumstances, and she had said she came from modest means but was hardworking and not a burden. She had not said she had money. She had been very careful not to say she had money, because she didn't. "I wrote that I was self-sufficient," she said, "that I supported myself through my work. I understood that to mean you had capital." Then there was a misunderstanding. The silence that landed between them was not a comfortable one. Around them, the ordinary business of the street continued, a horse being led past, 2 men talking in front of the hardware store, a woman crossing with a basket on her arm. Nobody was watching yet. That would come. "How much do you have?" he asked again. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not embarrassment, exactly. Something harder than embarrassment. "Enough to establish myself. I didn't come here to be a financial partner, Mr. Caldwell. I came because your letters suggested you were looking for a companion and a helpmate. Someone to build a life with." "I'm looking to expand the ranch," he said. "The Halverson property is going up for sale in the spring. I need capital to make an offer before someone else does. I thought we were in agreement on that." "We were never in agreement on that." Her voice was steady. She was proud of herself for that, later. "You never wrote to me about land deals. You wrote to me about—" "How much?" he said again, and now there was an edge to it. She told him. The look on his face was something she would carry with her for a long time. Not anger, exactly, which would have been easier, but a kind of flat dismissal, like a door closing quietly rather than slamming. He stepped back from her. One step, as though he needed the physical distance to complete a thought. "That's not going to work," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "I've made a mistake." His voice had risen slightly, carried on the September air to the barber who'd appeared in his doorway, and the 2 men who'd stopped talking to watch. "I don't know what kind of arrangement you think we had, but I'm not in the business of taking in strays." There it was. Clara did not move. She had the letter packet in her hand. She'd taken it out to show him, some instinct for evidence she'd barely understood at the time. And she held it, and she looked at him, and she said, very quietly, "You wrote to me for 6 months. I wrote to a woman I understood to have means. You're not that woman. I'm the woman who answered your letters." Then the letters were a waste of both our time. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out some coins, held them toward her, not pressed into her hand, held out flat on his palm, the way you'd offer feed to a horse. "There's a boarding house on Clement Street. Mrs. Hooper runs it. She'll put you up for a few days while you arrange your return passage." Clara looked at the coins. She looked at his face. She looked at the small audience that had gathered on the edges of the street without quite seeming to, the way people do when they sense something worth watching. She did not take the coins. "Keep your money, Mr. Caldwell. Don't be foolish. You've got no—" "I said keep it." She picked up her bag, straightened herself to her full height, which was not particularly impressive, 5'3" in her boots, and walked away from him. She didn't know where she was going. She walked north because north was away from him. And for the moment, away from him was the only direction that mattered. She heard him say something behind her, a short, dismissive sound that might have been a laugh, and then she heard nothing because she was concentrating on keeping her breathing even and her feet moving and her face arranged into something that could not be read as defeat. She made it almost to the end of the block before the shaking started in her hands. She stopped in an alley between the general store and a leather goods shop, tucked herself against the wall, and stood there until it passed. It took a while. She counted boards in the opposite wall to give herself something to focus on and breathed through her nose, and when the shaking finally stopped, she stood for another minute just to make sure. $63. A bag she could carry. 2 dresses. The letters, which were useless now, and which she shoved to the bottom of the bag without looking at them. The boots on her feet. The skills in her hands. She could sew. She could keep accounts. She could manage a household, plan meals for 20, mend anything short of a miracle. She spoke clearly and read well, and had been doing both since she was old enough to follow her mother behind the counter of the Locust Street shop and watch her charm difficult customers into becoming satisfied ones. What she did not have was a plan, a room, a friend, or any reason to believe that Carver's Crossing, Montana, was going to treat her any better than Ethan Caldwell just had. She came out of the alley and went to find Mrs. Hooper's boarding house, not because Caldwell had sent her there, but because she needed a place to sleep, and she was pragmatic enough to use what little information she had. Mrs. Hooper turned out to be a narrow woman of about 60, with the kind of face that had seen enough not to be easily surprised. She looked Clara over once and named her price. Clara paid for 3 nights. It left her with $44. The room was small and clean and cold in the way that rooms in Montana are cold in September. A chill that lived in the walls and couldn't be entirely argued out of them, no matter how much wood you burned. The bed was narrow. The window looked out onto a side yard where someone had left a rake propped against a fence post. Clara sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not crying, because she had made herself a rule about crying when she was 19, and a particularly bad customer had made her feel small in front of her mother. And the rule was, not in front of anyone, and she counted the walls as anyone. She sat there and she thought about what she had. She had skills, she had a small amount of money. She had arrived in a town where nobody knew her history except as the woman Ethan Caldwell had rejected in the street, which was bad, but also meant they knew nothing else about her, which was neutral and could be worked with. She had, she supposed, her own judgment, which had gotten her into this situation and could not therefore be entirely trusted, but which had also kept her alive and functional through the death of her mother and the loss of the shop and the long months of figuring out what came next, and so she was unwilling to throw it out entirely. She had the next 3 days. She would need to find work. Not seamstress work, not immediately. She didn't have a machine, didn't know the town well enough to build a clientele, and didn't have the capital to set up any kind of shop. She needed wage work, something that paid in cash and started soon. She went downstairs that evening and ate the meal that came with the room, salt pork and beans and cornbread, unremarkable but substantial. And she asked Mrs. Hooper conversationally, as if she were asking about the weather, whether there was anyone in town looking for household help. Mrs. Hooper looked at her with those unsurprised eyes. "You're the Caldwell woman," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I came from Philadelphia and I'm looking for work." A pause. Mrs. Hooper cut another piece of cornbread in half and didn't offer any of it. "Harlan's store might need someone for the counter, pays next to nothing. The Whitfield family had a kitchen girl who left in August, but Miriam Whitfield is difficult." She said this with no apparent opinion about the matter. "There's Blackthorn Ranch about 8 miles north, but Wyatt Blackthorn doesn't hire strangers." Clara filed all of this away. "What makes him particular about it?" "He's particular about everything," Mrs. Hooper said. "Lost his wife 4 years ago and hasn't been what you'd call sociable since. Runs a tight operation, doesn't ask for help and doesn't offer it." She stood up to clear something from the table. "He's not your answer." Clara said nothing to that. She thanked Mrs. Hooper for the meal and went back upstairs and sat by the window and watched the dark come down over Carver's Crossing, which happened fast out here, the light going all at once rather than fading the way it did back east. And she thought about everything and then tried to stop thinking about everything and eventually fell asleep sitting up. She spent the next day in town. She went to Harlan's store and spoke to a short, preoccupied man named Gerald Harlan, who told her the position was filled. She went to the Whitfield house on the good end of Clement Street and knocked on the back door and spoke to Miriam Whitfield, who was exactly as difficult as advertised. A woman who asked 6 questions for everyone Clara answered and seemed to be looking for reasons to say no. Clara answered everything patiently and accurately and was told she'd hear something by the end of the week. She walked the town. She learned its shape. The main street ran east to west, commercial on both sides for about 3 blocks, then thinning out into houses and then open land. The railroad didn't come through here, which meant the town existed on ranching and the trade that ranching generated, and that meant the rhythms of the place were tied to seasons and livestock in ways she didn't know yet but could learn. She learned who Ethan Caldwell was, piece by piece, from the fragments of conversation available to a woman who was quiet and attentive in the places where people talked. He was the largest landowner in the valley. He'd bought his first property cheap 10 years ago when the previous owner had a bad year and needed cash, and he'd been acquiring since then, slowly but consistently, and he had a way of being present when people were vulnerable that several people described differently. Some called it savvy, some called it opportunistic, and at least one old man at the feed store used a word that made Clara's opinion of him drop further than she'd thought possible. He had not, apparently, been looking for a wife so much as looking for a business partner he could legally bind to himself. The mail-order arrangement had been, as far as Clara could reconstruct it, an attempt to find capital through matrimony rather than through the bank, which likely had views about his creditworthiness that he wanted to avoid. She should have felt used. She did feel used. But she also felt something cooler, sitting underneath the anger, something that had to do with recognizing the nature of the game now that she could see the board. On the morning of her second day, she went to the mercantile and spent 40 cents on supplies she needed: thread, a small bottle of ink, paper, and then spent the rest of the morning writing a careful letter to a seamstress's cooperative in Billings that her mother had mentioned once as a possible resource for women working independently. She didn't know if they'd respond or what they could offer, but a letter cost 3 cents and hope was free. In the afternoon, it began to rain. By evening, it was something more than rain, a cold, driving thing that came in sideways and found every gap in the boarding house's construction and made itself at home. Mrs. Hooper lit the parlor fire early and sat with her mending and did not offer conversation, and Clara sat at the small desk in her room and looked at the $41 she had left and did the arithmetic that was becoming unavoidable. If she didn't find work in the next week, she would run out of money before she ran out of winter. She could go back east. She had enough for the stage to Billings and probably the train east from there, and she knew people in Philadelphia, not friends exactly, not anymore, but acquaintances, women from the church her mother had attended, a woman who ran a boarding house on Pine Street who had once offered her a reference. She could go back. She could go back, and she would be the woman who went west and failed and came back, and she would be 30 before she found another situation half as promising as the one she'd just lost, and she would spend the rest of her life in a city that reminded her of everything she'd lost rather than promising her anything new. She did not want to go back. She stayed up later than she should have, listening to the rain, and somewhere around midnight she reached into the bottom of her bag and took out the letters and untied the twine and read through them one more time. Not for sentiment, but for evidence. She was looking for the specific moment where the misunderstanding had occurred, the place where she had understood one thing and he had meant another, because she needed to know if she had been foolish or simply unlucky. By the time she finished reading, she thought it was both, and she thought there was nothing to be done about it now except move forward. She put the letters in the grate and watched them burn. The next morning she woke before light, something restless in her that she'd learned not to argue with over the years. She dressed in her second dress, the darker one that was more practical, and she laced her boots and she went downstairs and ate the breakfast Mrs. Hooper set out: oatmeal, strong coffee. And then she went outside. The storm had passed but left a cold clarity behind it, the air sharp and clean and carrying a smell she couldn't quite name, something mineral and green at once. The streets were muddy. She walked anyway. She walked north without particular intention, following the road out of town because the town itself was beginning to feel like a trap, and she needed to see the edge of it. The land opened up around her quickly, the way it did out here. She could see for miles in every direction. Grass gone brown and gold for the season, ridgelines, the suggestion of mountains to the west. The road was rutted from the rain, and she had to pick her steps, but she kept walking because she wasn't ready to turn back yet. She walked for almost an hour. She hadn't intended to walk that far, and she was thinking about turning around when she heard the sound. A sharp crack, then a low groan that took her a moment to identify. She stopped, listened, and heard it again. Wood giving way. She was near a stand of trees along what must be a creek, now swollen with the storm's runoff, and through the trees she could see the corner of a structure, a barn or what was left of one. The roof on one side had come down. She was close enough that she went to look. The barn was old. She could see that much. And the roof had given way under the weight of the storm. One whole section collapsed inward, and inside, underneath the wreckage, a leg was moving, a horse's leg, trapped. Clara ran. She was not someone who ran toward things that were dangerous. She knew that about herself, or thought she did. She ran toward the horse because the leg was moving and that meant it was alive, and because she couldn't see herself walking away from something alive and trapped. Not after the last 3 days. The barn door was off its hinges. She pushed it open enough to get through and found the interior dark and dusty and full of the smell of old hay and wet wood, and she found the horse, a big bay, maybe 15 hands, pinned on its side by a fallen beam across its hindquarters. The animal's head was up, ears flat, eyes white-rimmed with fear, and it was cycling between stillness and short, desperate surges against the weight, gaining nothing. "Easy," she said. Pointlessly, probably. The horse didn't speak English, but she said it again anyway, softer, crouching down where the horse could see her clearly. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." She assessed the beam. It was too heavy for her to lift alone. She looked around the barn for anything useful, a lever, a rope, any kind of tackle, and found an old iron pry bar hung on a nail near what had been the tack area. She took it down and came back to the beam and found the angle and set the pry bar under it and put her weight on it. She was not strong in the way that suggested this would work. She was 5'3" and hadn't eaten enough over the last 3 days and had no leverage point worth speaking of. But she worked the bar, shifting slightly each time, and the beam moved, almost nothing, an inch, 2 inches. And she felt the horse surge against it and heard the sound of something giving, and suddenly the horse was scrabbling on the floor, legs churning, and then it was upright, and Clara fell backward when the pry bar slipped and the beam crashed down again where the horse had been. She lay on her back in the old hay for a moment, looking at the damaged roof. The horse stood at the far end of the barn, trembling, nose working, looking at her. "You're welcome," she said. She was sitting up, checking herself for damage, a scrape on her palm, her dress muddy, when the barn door was pushed wider and a man came through it. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a coat that had seen genuine work rather than performed it. He was maybe 35, though there was something weathered about him that made the number hard to pin down. He looked at Clara first, then at the horse, then back at Clara, and his expression went through several things in a short time: alarm, assessment, a complicated surprise. "What happened?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like someone reconstructing an event by looking at its aftermath. "The roof came in," Clara said. "Your horse was caught." "I can see that." He crossed to the horse, ran his hands along its legs, its sides, with the efficiency of someone who knew what he was checking for and had checked for it many times before. The horse settled slightly under his hands. "Are you hurt?" "No." He looked at her palm, which she hadn't managed to hide in time. "That looks like hurt." "It's a scrape." He straightened up from the horse and looked at her directly for the first time, not the surveying look that men gave women as a matter of course, but something more lateral, like he was looking at the situation rather than at her specifically. "What were you doing in my barn?" "Walking past and hearing something," she said. "I came to look." "And decided to try to free a horse by yourself." "There wasn't anyone else." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pry bar on the ground, at the beam, at the clear evidence of how she'd done it. He looked at the horse again. "That was stupid," he said. "I know. He could have come up on you." "I know that too." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it, something that acknowledged a fact without quite celebrating it. He picked up the pry bar from the ground and hung it back on its nail with the ease of someone returning something to its home. "Wyatt Blackthorne," he said. Clara stood up and brushed the hay from her dress and thought about what Mrs. Hooper had told her. Doesn't ask for help and doesn't offer it. "Clara Whitmore." "I know who you are," he said. "Of course you do." "Small town," he said without apology. "Yes." She picked up her bag, which she'd dropped when she came through the door. "Your horse should probably be seen by someone who knows what to look for. He was pinned for some time, I think, before I got here." "I'll look him over." Wyatt moved to the door and held it for her. Not a gallant gesture so much as a practical one, since the door tended to swing back. Outside, the cold air hit her face again. She could feel the scrape on her palm more now that the adrenaline was settling. She started to walk past him. "Miss Whitmore?" She stopped. I was looking at her with that same lateral attention, and she waited for something patronizing, some acknowledgement of her situation designed to make her feel helped. But instead he said, "Are you any good at figures?" She turned around. "What kind of figures?" "Ranch accounts. I've got 3 months of bookkeeping in a state I'd describe as approximate, and I need someone who can sort it out." He was looking at her with the direct discomfort of a man who found asking for things difficult. "My last hand who did the books left in July." I haven't replaced him. I'm a seamstress, she said. Can you do accounts? I kept books for my mother's shop for 8 years. He nodded once. 3 days' work? Maybe 4? I'd pay fair for it. Meals included while you're here. He paused. It's not charity. I know what charity looks like, she said. What does fair pay mean to you? He named a number. It was reasonable. Not generous, but reasonable. The number of a man who knew what work was worth and wasn't interested in either over or underpaying for it. Clara looked at the barn, at the horse standing quiet now in the dim interior, at the man who had called her work stupid and meant it as a neutral observation. She thought about $41 and Miriam Whitfield, and the chance that the boarding house was going to start feeling like a coffin if she spent another week there. Tomorrow morning, she said, I'll need directions. He gave them to her. She walked back to town with the cold air on her face and the scrape on her hand starting to properly sting, and something moving in her chest that felt cautiously, a little like possibility. Not hope exactly. She'd been burned by hope recently enough to treat it carefully, but possibility, which was a smaller thing and more reliable. 8 miles north. Tomorrow morning. She walked back through Carver's Crossing and did not look at Ethan Caldwell's office as she passed it, and she went upstairs to her room and washed the scrape on her hand and ate the meal Mrs. Hooper set out and went to bed early. She lay in the dark and thought about the horse. She thought about the way it had stood at the end of the barn, trembling, watching her. She thought about the particular loneliness of being trapped under something heavy with no way to understand why and no way to call for help. She thought she knew something about that. She thought about the way Wyatt Blackthorne had looked at her work with the pry bar. Not with admiration, not with the particular kind of surprise that men had when a woman did something physical, but with the cool assessment of someone who was simply noting what had been done and how. She hadn't been made to feel remarkable or foolish. She'd been noted. She hadn't been noted in a while. Tomorrow morning, she told herself. You'll figure out the rest from there. She closed her eyes and listened to the Montana night. The wind in the eaves, the distant sound of something moving in the dark outside, the particular silence of a place that had no interest in your troubles and went about its business regardless. And she did not feel afraid exactly, but she felt the size of what she'd gotten herself into, and she filed that away beside everything else and let herself fall towards sleep. She was awake before the alarm she'd set in her head. She was always awake before the alarm she'd set in her head. That was something anyway. The directions Wyatt had given her were plain and accurate, which she appreciated, because men who gave directions in this country tended toward one of two failures, either too vague, assuming you'd figure it out, or too detailed in the wrong ways, describing landmarks that had moved or changed seasons ago. Wyatt had said, North Road out of town, past the Split Rock Formation on the left, cross the creek at the shallow ford, follow the fence line until you see the gate with the iron W. 8 miles. Allow 2 hours on foot. She allowed 2 hours on foot. She arrived at the gate at 8:30 in the morning with mud on her boots and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and her bag over her shoulder because she hadn't been sure whether to bring it or leave it at Mrs. Hooper's, and she'd decided bringing it was the kind of decision that left options open. The iron W was there, exactly as described. A simple letter, functional rather than decorative, bolted to the top crossbar of a gate that had been repaired in several places with wire and good workmanship rather than replaced. A working gate, not a proud one. She noted that. A boy of about 14 was coming across the yard when she pushed the gate open. He stopped and looked at her with the frank appraisal of someone too young to have learned to hide what he was thinking. You the woman from town? He said. Clara Whitmore. Pete. He jerked his chin toward the main house. Mr. Blackthorne said to bring you in when you got here. He's in the barn. He looked at her bag. You staying? For a few days, to do the books. Pete considered this and seemed to reach a neutral verdict. He led her across the yard, which was muddy from the previous day's rain, and busy in the way ranch yards always were in the morning. A man she didn't know yet carrying a water bucket, another one repairing something on a fence section near the corral, the sound of animals and work coming from several directions at once. The main house was 2 stories, wooden, plain, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front. Someone had started painting it at some point and run out of either paint or will at the halfway mark. Wyatt was in the barn with the bay horse from the previous day, running his hands along the animal's near hindquarter with focused attention. He looked up when she came in but didn't stop what he was doing. Miss Whitmore, how is he? Bruised, nothing broken. He straightened up. He'll be stiff for a week. He said it without additional editorial, which she took as an acknowledgement that it could have been worse. Come inside and I'll show you the books. The books were in a room off the main hall that served as an office. A desk, 2 chairs, shelves with various documents and ledgers stacked in a way that suggested they'd been organized once and then had slowly returned to chaos over time. On the desk was a stack of ledgers and a separate pile of loose papers that appeared to be receipts, invoices, and various other documents in no particular order. Clara sat down and looked at it without comment. She had seen worse. The shop on Locust Street, in the last 2 years of her mother's illness, had been worse. Wyatt stood in the doorway. I know it's not in good shape. It's workable, she said. Can you tell me the period you need sorted out? June through August. I know what came in and went out in rough terms, but not the specifics. I need to know where I actually stand before winter. Do you have a system you were using, or did the previous person have their own? Henderson had his own. Whatever it was, he took most of his notes with him when he left. A pause that communicated something about the circumstances of Henderson's departure without specifying what. Start fresh if you have to. I'll need to understand your operation first, she said. What you run, how many head, what contracts you have for sale. He told her. He was efficient about it. No unnecessary elaboration, no throat clearing, just the facts in the order they were relevant. She took notes. By the time he finished, she had 2 pages of her own neat writing and a preliminary sense of what she was dealing with, which was a cattle operation of medium size that was not failing but was not thriving, that had several outstanding feed contracts she'd need to find documentation for, and that appeared to have a small secondary income from breaking horses that hadn't been accounted for anywhere she could see. The horse work, she said. Is that regular? Occasional. It needs to be in the ledger. Henderson didn't bother with it. Henderson's books are the reason you don't know where you stand, she said. She said it plainly, without accusation. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded once, which she took for agreement. He left her to it. She worked through the morning without stopping, sorting the loose papers first into categories. Receipts for feed and supplies, records of cattle sales, notes about labor costs, and then beginning to build a ledger from the ground up, using the existing books as reference where they were useful and her own system where they weren't. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that required patience and a tolerance for small discrepancies that had to be tracked back through several documents to resolve, and Clara had both of those things. At noon, a woman appeared in the doorway. Not young, maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair and an expression that was measuring rather than hostile. Mr. Blackthorne says to eat, she said. Thank you. I'll be there in a moment. Now, the woman said. Food doesn't hold. Clara put down her pen and followed her to the kitchen, where the woman, whose name turned out to be Ruth, and who was housekeeper, cook, and apparently keeper of the schedule, served them beans and salt pork and fresh bread that was substantially better than anything Clara had eaten since leaving Philadelphia. Wyatt was already at the table. Pete was there too, eating fast and watching Clara with the intermittent attention of a boy who was trying to seem like he wasn't paying attention. How bad is it? Wyatt asked. Ask me again at the end of the day, Clara said. There are gaps I haven't traced yet. Rough estimate. You're not in debt, she said. Beyond that, I need to keep working. He nodded and ate. Ruth sat at the far end of the table and did not join the conversation, which Clara noted was the practiced absence of someone who heard everything and chose not to participate in most of it. Pete spilled his coffee and swore under his breath and looked at Wyatt with the apprehension of someone unsure of the consequences. Clean it up, Wyatt said, without looking up from his food. Pete cleaned it up. It was a working household. Not warm, exactly, but functional in a way that had its own kind of steadiness to it. And after 3 days in Mrs. Hooper's stiff parlor, Clara found the functionality a relief. She went back to the books after lunch. By mid-afternoon, she had isolated the problem. Henderson had been recording sales income, but had not been consistently recording the costs associated with those sales, which meant the books showed a healthier operation than actually existed. It wasn't fraud, exactly. She didn't see any evidence of deliberate manipulation. It was just incompetence dressed up as record-keeping, and it had left Wyatt with an overly optimistic picture of his margins. She found the horse-breaking income too, in a separate cash book that had been tucked under the ledgers, and that Henderson apparently hadn't known about or hadn't thought to integrate. Once she added it in, the picture shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. She was still working when the light started to change, the afternoon going gold through the office window in the way it did out here, longer and more horizontal than back east. She heard boots in the hall, and then Wyatt appeared in the doorway again. "You can stop for the day," he said. "I want to finish this column." He waited. She finished the column. He was still there. "The cash book under the ledgers," she said, without looking up. "The one for the horse work. Do you keep that separate intentionally?" Henderson kept it separate. "It shouldn't be separate. It's income from your operation. It should be in the main accounts." "All right. Also." She hesitated because this was the kind of thing that could be heard as accusation if she wasn't careful. "Your feed contracts, the ones from June and July. I can only find documentation for 2 of them, but based on the expense records, there should be at least 4. Do you know where the other paperwork would be?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Henderson handled all the contract paperwork." "Then Henderson may have left with more than his notes." Another silence, different from the first one. She watched him absorb this and file it somewhere. Not with anger, or at least not with anger she could see, but with the careful stillness of a man who was revising something he'd believed and didn't enjoy the revision. "Can you work with what you have?" "I can reconstruct the amounts from the expense records. It won't be the same as having the contracts, but it'll be accurate enough for your purposes." She paused. "If there's ever a dispute about those contracts, you'll want the originals." "I'll look for them." She closed the ledger she was working in and stacked it neatly. Her hand ached from several hours of writing. She flexed it carefully, and the scrape from the previous day caught and stung. Wyatt noticed. "Ruth keeps a salve for cuts," he said. "In the kitchen." "I'm fine." "It'll get infected in this weather if you leave it." She looked at him. He was not offering sympathy. He was offering a fact, the way he offered most things. Plainly, without decoration. She found she didn't mind it. "Where in the kitchen?" she said. "Second shelf above the stove. Blue tin." She found the tin. Ruth was still in the kitchen, washing dishes, and watched without comment as Clara cleaned the scrape more thoroughly and applied the salve, which smelled of something herbal and sharp, and worked almost immediately. Clara put the lid back on the tin and set it exactly where she'd found it. "You staying the night?" Ruth asked, not looking up from the dishes. "I hadn't planned to." "It's a long walk back to town in the dark." Clara considered this. She looked at the window where the last of the afternoon light was genuinely going now. She had not planned to stay the night. She had not brought enough with her to stay the night. She had her bag, which had 2 dresses in it, and the basic materials of a traveling life, which meant she was, technically, equipped to stay anywhere that offered a horizontal surface and a blanket. "There's a room," Ruth said, still not looking at her. "Small one, upstairs. Nothing fancy." I couldn't impose. "You're being practical," Ruth said, "which is more than most people are." She set a dish in the rack and picked up another. "Breakfast is at 6. Mr. Blackthorne starts early." Clara slept in the small room upstairs, which had a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the yard and a hook on the wall where she could hang her second dress. It was colder than Mrs. Hooper's room, which she hadn't thought possible. She slept anyway, deeply, more deeply than she had in a week, and woke before 6 to the sound of the ranch already moving. Boots on the porch stairs, the sound of the well pump, Pete's voice saying something she couldn't make out. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair while still half asleep, and went downstairs. The next 2 days established a rhythm she hadn't expected. She worked in the office from after breakfast until noon, broke for the midday meal, worked again until the light went. Wyatt moved in and out of her field of awareness the way the ranch's larger operations did, present, purposeful, not requiring anything from her beyond the work she was doing. Ruth brought coffee at mid-morning without being asked. Pete occasionally lingered in the hallway outside the office with no apparent purpose and vanished when noticed. She finished the June accounts on the second evening. She called Wyatt in and showed him what she'd found: the actual margins, the missing documentation, the horse-breaking income that hadn't been accounted for, the more realistic picture of where the ranch stood going into winter. He sat across the desk from her and looked at the numbers in silence for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd made an error. She went back over the column she'd shown him, following her own notation, and couldn't find one. "This is right," he said finally. "As right as I can make it with what I have." He looked at it again. "It's not as bad as I feared." "No, but it's not as good as Henderson's book suggested." "Henderson was a fool." He said it without heat. "I kept him too long because he was convenient." "Most mistakes come from convenient choices," Clara said, and then wondered if that was too direct. She looked at her hands. He didn't seem to take offense. He looked at the ledger again, tracing a line with one finger. Not reading, she thought, just thinking with his hands the way some people did. "How much more to finish?" he said. "July and August. 2 more days, maybe 3. He nodded. He looked up at her, and there was something different in it. Not warmer exactly, but more direct, the way a person looked at you when they'd reassessed something and reached a different conclusion. "You're good at this," he said. "I had practice." "Who taught you?" "My mother. She kept her own books for 20 years. Clara paused. "She was meticulous about it. She said if you didn't know exactly where you stood financially, someone else would eventually decide it for you." Something moved in Wyatt's face at that. A compression, quick and gone. "She was right," he said. He left her to it. On the 3rd morning, one of the ranch hands, a man named Cal, who was the oldest employee on the property, wire-thin and sun-darkened and possessed of an economy of expression that rivaled Wyatt's, appeared in the office doorway while she was working. He stood there long enough that she looked up. "Something I can help you with?" she said. "Just looking." He said it without embarrassment. "Heard you fixed up Price." It took her a moment to realize he meant the horse. "I had a pry bar." "Not everybody would have tried." It didn't seem like a moment for deliberation. Cal looked at her with the faintly amused expression of a man who had heard a lot of people talk about themselves and was occasionally surprised. He left without another word. She went back to the accounts. The gap in the feed contracts was bothering her. Not for accounting purposes, she had reconstructed the amounts adequately from expense records, but because the missing documentation suggested a carelessness, or something more than carelessness, that didn't fit with the rest of what she was learning about Wyatt Blackthorne. He was not a careless man. The ranch showed it, the gates repaired rather than replaced, the careful use of materials, the way he went over the horse with his hands, as though checking an asset he couldn't afford to lose, but also, she suspected, as though the horse itself mattered. Men who were purely economical didn't touch animals that way. So Henderson had either been negligent, possible, or had taken the contracts for a reason. She didn't say this to Wyatt yet. It was possible she was building a theory out of incomplete materials, and she'd learned to wait until she had enough information to hold the shape of a thing before she said it aloud. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she found the first reference to Ethan Caldwell in the ranch's records. It was in a water rights document, filed at the back of the 2nd ledger, a formal notice from the previous year about the water usage on a shared creek that ran between the Blackthorne property and a parcel to the south. The language was dense and legal, not something she could fully interpret without knowing more, but Caldwell's name was in it as a third party, not as the original claimant, but as someone who had acquired an interest in the water rights dispute through a separate purchase. She read it twice and then set it aside. She finished August that evening. She called Wyatt in and showed him the completed accounts. 3 months, fully reconciled, with a summary she'd written on a fresh sheet showing his actual position, his outstanding obligations, and the places where she thought the records were still incomplete. He read the summary. He looked at the water rights document when she set it on the desk. His jaw did something. "Where did you find this?" "Back of the 2nd ledger." Henderson may not have known it was there, or may not have thought it was significant. "It's significant." His voice was level, but there was something under it. "Caldwell's been trying to establish a claim on the South Fork of the creek for 2 years. That notice was his first formal move." "Is it a legitimate claim?" "No." He said it simply. "My family settled this land 30 years ago. The water rights were established then. Caldwell bought his property 5 years ago, and now he wants the water that was here before him." He stopped. "I have a lawyer in Billings. He told me the notice was preliminary and probably nothing. I should have followed up." "You should have," Clara agreed. She said it carefully, not as criticism, but as confirmation. He looked at her and nodded. "What else did you find?" "Nothing else about Caldwell, but I want to understand the missing feed contracts. Is it possible Caldwell had any connection to them? Wyatt was still. Henderson left to work for Caldwell, he said. I found that out later, in August. The room was quiet. Outside, the sounds of the ranch in the early evening. Someone closing the barn door, the horses settling, the wind that came every evening out of the northwest, went on without reference to what was happening inside. Then the missing contracts may not be accidental, Clara said. No, Wyatt said. They may not. She was thinking about the water rights document, about the name that had appeared in it, about the man who had stood in the middle of Harlan Street and held out coins on his flat palm as though she were something to be dispensed with. She was thinking about Henderson, who had kept careless books and then left to work for the man whose name appeared in a legal dispute with the ranch he'd just abandoned. She was thinking about the fact that she had $63 when she arrived and now had 4 days of wages coming, which was not the same as security, but was a different kind of position than the one she'd been in when she walked north out of Carver's Crossing 4 mornings ago. I'll have the full ledger ready for you tomorrow, she said. Clean copy, everything organized, with a note on the missing documents so you know exactly what you'd need to complete the record. Wyatt looked at her. He looked at the ledger, at the summary sheet, at the water rights notice he'd set down on the desk. He looked at her again with that lateral attention that she'd noticed the first day, in the barn. The look that wasn't assessment of her as a woman, but something more impersonal, and also, she was beginning to think, more respectful. The household, he said. She waited. Ruth is getting older, he said. The work's harder than it used to be for her. I've been thinking about bringing on someone to help with the household side of things. Accounts, management, keeping the supplier records in order. He stopped. She had the sense he was choosing words with difficulty, not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because asking was uncomfortable for him. It's not what you trained for. I trained for whatever needed doing, she said. It's not permanent, he said. I'm not in a position to offer anything permanent, but it's steady work through the winter and into spring, and the pay would be fair. She thought about Mrs. Hooper's cold room and the arithmetic that kept coming out the same no matter how she arranged it. She thought about the letter she'd sent to the cooperative in Billings, which may or may not produce anything. She thought about the iron W on the gate, the repaired fence sections, Cal who had come to the office doorway to tell her she'd done something worth mentioning. She thought about the water rights document and the name in it, and the things she was beginning to understand about what was happening on this particular piece of Montana land. Through the winter and into spring, she said. Yes. And you'll let me know if that changes. I will. She looked at him. He met it. Neither of them looked away, which wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but was the kind of moment that had a slight weight to it, a recognition of terms being set between two people who were both, she thought, somewhat cautious by nature and somewhat bad at asking for things. All right, she said. She went upstairs that night and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at her bag, which she'd never unpacked because she'd been planning to leave, and she thought about unpacking it now. 2 dresses, a needle case, a bottle of ink, $63 that was now $63 plus 4 days' wages and climbing. She unpacked the bag. She hung the second dress on the hook. She set the needle case on the windowsill and the ink beside it. She put the bag itself in the corner, folded flat. The room looked different with her things in it, not comfortable yet, not quite hers, but occupied, in the way that spaces become occupied when someone stops treating them as temporary. She lay down and listened to the wind off the mountains and thought about Ruth and Cal and Pete, who lingered in doorways and pretended not to watch. She thought about Wyatt Blackthorne, who had found her in a wrecked barn standing over his horse with a pry bar, and called it stupid before asking if she was hurt. She thought about a water rights notice and a man who had taken the ranch's contracts when he left. She thought about Ethan Caldwell, who had held out coins on a flat palm, and thought that was the end of her. She was not the end. Outside, the wind kept moving. The ranch kept its sounds, horse and timber, and the particular silences between. Clara lay in the narrow bed in the small room and felt, for the first time since the stagecoach had pulled into Carver's Crossing, that the ground under her was something other than temporary. Not safe. She wasn't foolish enough to call it safe, but solid. And for now, solid was enough. The winter came in the way winters do in Montana. Not all at once, but in increments that each seemed manageable until you looked back and realized they'd added up to something you couldn't argue with. By the first week of October, the mornings had a bite that didn't leave until midday, and by the second week, midday itself had stopped pretending. Clara had been at Blackthorn Ranch for 3 weeks when the first real frost came. She woke to it. The particular silence of a frozen morning, the way sound travels differently when the ground is hard, and lay in the narrow bed for a moment before she heard Ruth already moving in the kitchen below, and that was enough to get her up. She had established herself in those 3 weeks in the way that useful people establish themselves in working places, not by announcement, but by accumulation. She had completed the accounts. She had reorganized the supplier records into a system that could be maintained by someone without her background, which was something she'd done deliberately, because she understood that her position was still provisional, and she wanted whatever she built here to outlast her uncertainty. She had taken over the management of the household budget from Ruth, who had been keeping it in her head for years and seemed genuinely relieved to hand it to paper. She had mended 3 shirts, repaired a torn harness strap that was waiting to be sent to the leather goods shop in town, and spent one long afternoon teaching Pete, who was surprisingly willing to learn and even more surprisingly good at it, the basics of keeping a running expense log. She had not, in those 3 weeks, gone back into town. This was partly practical. The work kept her occupied, and the ranch was 8 miles out, and partly something she hadn't named yet, a reluctance to stand on that main street again and feel the thing she'd felt when Ethan Caldwell looked at her and reached for his coins. She knew she'd have to go eventually. She wasn't hiding. But she was choosing her moment, and her moment hadn't come yet. It came on a Thursday in mid-October, when Wyatt said he needed to go to town for supplies, and asked if she wanted to come, because there were household items on the list, and Ruth's knees had been worse this week, and she knew the list better than he did. She said yes before she'd finished thinking about it. They went in the wagon, which was faster than walking and significantly less comfortable, the bench seat having seen better decades, and the road having absorbed the previous week's rain in ways that made the trip a conversation with every rut. Wyatt drove. Clara sat beside him with the supply list in her coat pocket and her hands folded in her lap. And they didn't talk much for the first few miles, which she'd come to understand was not unfriendliness, but simply the way he occupied space, fully present, not filling it with noise. The mountains to the west were showing snow on their upper ridges. She watched them for a while. "Do you get much snow at the ranch?" she said. "Some winters worse than others." He kept his eyes on the road. 63 was bad. My father talked about it until he died. Said they lost a third of the herd, and 2 of the men got frostbite bad enough to lose fingers. "Your father ranched here?" "He started it. Came out from Missouri in '51 with my mother and 2 horses and a considerable amount of optimism." Something in his voice that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it. "My mother always said the optimism was the most useful thing he brought." "Is she still living?" "No, she died the year after my wife." He said it the way people say things they've said enough times that the words no longer cut at the surface, though she suspected the cut was still there, just deeper. "It was a hard couple of years." She didn't offer a response to that, because she'd learned that some statements weren't looking for responses so much as witnesses, and she let it stand. They came into Carver's Crossing from the north end of the main street, and the first thing Clara registered was that it looked different than it had when she'd arrived. Or rather, she looked at it differently, knowing the shape of it now, knowing which buildings were fronts for what arrangements and which names belonged to which faces, and what the general attitude of the place was toward outsiders who arrived without luggage worth speaking of. She was still an outsider. She didn't mistake 3 weeks on a ranch 8 miles out for belonging. But she was a different kind of outsider than she'd been when the stagecoach rolled in. And the difference was information, and information was the only thing she'd ever fully trusted. They went to the feed store first. Wyatt dealt with the order, and she looked at the household items on the list and went to the mercantile, where she spent 20 minutes selecting what was needed with the focused efficiency of a woman who had learned to make every cent count and had no patience for paying more than a thing was worth. The owner of the mercantile, a heavy-set man named Prater, watched her with the mild curiosity of someone encountering a type he'd catalogued before: capable woman, making decisions, no unnecessary conversation, and didn't try to upsell her, which she appreciated. She was coming out of the mercantile with a wrapped package under her arm when she saw Ethan Caldwell across the street. He was talking to 2 men she didn't know outside his office, the building she'd passed without looking at on her way back from the barn 3 weeks ago. He had the stance of a man conducting business, upright and slightly forward-leaning, and he was doing most of the talking. One of the other men was nodding at intervals. The other was watching the street. That one saw her first. He said something to Caldwell. Caldwell turned. He looked at her across the street, and she looked back, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said something to the men he was with, and they dispersed, and he crossed the street toward her with the measured pace of a man who wanted to give the impression that he was not in a hurry about anything. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He stopped at a reasonable distance. His voice was cordial. That was the part that bothered her. The cordiality, which was a performance, and a practiced one. "You're still in Carver's Crossing, as you can see. I heard you'd taken a position at Blackthorn Ranch." His tone communicated several things simultaneously without committing to any of them. "Temporary, I imagine." "Through the winter," she said. "At least." His mouth moved in something that fell short of a smile. "That's a difficult property to build a future on." He was watching her with the careful attention of a man who was deciding how much of what he actually thought to reveal. Wyatt Blackthorn is a man with more stubbornness than resources, and those two things have a way of catching up with each other. That's an interesting thing to say to someone who works for him. It's an honest thing. He tilted his head slightly. "I'm offering you a perspective, Miss Whitmore. Nothing more." "I have all the perspectives I need, thank you." He looked at her for a moment longer. "I could use someone with bookkeeping skills," he said, "at my operation. The pay would be better than what Blackthorn can offer, and the situation would be considerably more stable." The audacity of it was so complete that she almost laughed. She felt it rising and pressed it down, because laughing at Ethan Caldwell in the middle of the street would make a scene, and she wasn't ready to make a scene today. "You rejected me on this street 3 weeks ago," she said quietly, "in front of a dozen people, and now you're offering me employment." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, only slightly. "Circumstances change. I may have been hasty." "You were precise," she said. "You said exactly what you meant. So did I, when I declined your coins. Nothing has changed on my end." She shifted the package under her arm. "Good day, Mr. Caldwell." She walked to the feed store to find Wyatt. She didn't tell him about the encounter immediately. She told him in the wagon on the way back because the alternating choices were to say nothing, which felt wrong, or to make a larger thing of it than it was. And the wagon ride was the right register for the right amount of it. He listened without looking at her, his eyes on the road. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "He offered you a position," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "I don't know exactly. To get me away from the ranch, possibly. Or possibly he simply thinks everything's available for purchase." She looked at the road ahead. "I told him no." "I gathered." Another silence. "Did he say anything about the ranch?" She told him what Caldwell had said. The phrase about stubbornness and resources, the implication about stability. Wyatt's jaw did the thing it did when he was processing something he didn't like. He said nothing for a full minute. "He's been buying land south of here," Wyatt said finally. 3 parcels in the last year, all of them with creek access. He paused. "The water from the South Fork feeds this ranch through the dry months. Without it, we'd be hauling." "And with the missing contracts," Clara said. "And if he's got Henderson to confirm there were supply issues this summer. He could make a case that I'm a poor manager of resources." Wyatt's voice was very level. "Which would support an argument that I shouldn't have priority water rights over a better managed operation." She'd reached the same place. She was glad he'd arrived there himself rather than needing her to walk him to it, because it was easier to work with someone who could follow the shape of a problem than someone who needed the problem described from every angle. "The Billings lawyer," she said. "I'll write to him this week." "Don't write. Go." She said it before she'd thought through whether it was her place to say it, and then decided it was her place because this was now her winter too. Letters get lost. Things get delayed. If the water rights are as important as you're saying, you need to talk to him in person, and you need to bring every document we have. He looked at her sideways. "We." She heard herself. "I meant the documents from the ranch." He looked back at the road. He didn't correct her, which was a form of agreement she was coming to understand. Wyatt's agreements rarely came in sentences. They came in the absence of contradiction. She was in the office 2 mornings later, pulling together the water rights documentation into a folder for the Billings trip, when she heard the wagon in the yard and then voices, one of them Wyatt's, the other one unfamiliar. She went to the window and saw Caldwell's man standing near the gate, not Caldwell himself. One of the men who'd been with him on the street, the one who'd spotted her first, a compact, watchful man in a dark coat. She went to the front porch. Wyatt was there, hands in his pockets, listening. "Mr. Caldwell wants you to know he's prepared to make a fair offer on the south pasture," the man was saying, "before the winter makes the whole question academic." "Tell Mr. Caldwell the south pasture isn't for sale," Wyatt said. "He thought you might say that. He asked me to mention that the water situation being what it is, it might be smarter to sell at a fair price now than wait and sell under different circumstances later." Clara stood on the porch and watched Wyatt's face do something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, which would have been simple, but something more deliberate than anger, a kind of settling, the way a structure settles when weight is applied and it decides whether to hold or give. It held. "You've delivered the message," Wyatt said. "Good day." The man looked at Clara. He looked back at Wyatt. He left. The silence after the wagon was gone had a different quality than ordinary silence. Clara came down from the porch. Wyatt was still standing in the yard, looking at the gate. "He's moving faster than I expected," he said. "He saw me in town," Clara said. "He knows you have someone doing the books. He knows whatever Henderson told him about the gaps in your records won't hold as long as it might have." She paused. "He's trying to get ahead of it." Wyatt turned and looked at her. "You think he'll try something beyond an offer?" "I think a man who sends an emissary to make a veiled threat 2 days after running into me on the street is a man who doesn't like timelines other people set." She kept her voice steady. "What other pressure can he apply?" "He has influence with this county assessor," Wyatt said. "If he wanted to make trouble about the property valuation, he could. It wouldn't change ownership, but it could affect the tax burden in a bad year," he thought. "He also has 3 of the 4 men on the water board. If he filed a formal claim on the South Fork, it could go through faster than it should." "Then we move faster than he does," Clara said. It was the first time she'd used "we" without correcting herself. Wyatt noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He said, "I'll go to Billings next week," and went back to work. The week that followed was the kind of week that seems quiet on the surface because all the activity is happening underneath it. Clara organized the documentation. She spent an evening drafting a timeline of the water rights dispute from the records she had, cross-referencing dates between the formal notice, the missing contracts, and Henderson's departure, because she wanted to see whether the timing told a story, and it did. Henderson had left within 2 weeks of the formal notice appearing, and the contracts that were missing covered the period immediately before the notice was filed, which meant someone had been thinking ahead. She showed the timeline to Wyatt the night before he left for Billings. He read it twice. He looked up. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "Women don't become lawyers." "They should." He folded the timeline and put it with the folder. He looked at the stack of documents she'd assembled, organized by date, labeled in her clear handwriting, with a summary sheet on top that told the lawyer everything he'd need to know before he looked at anything else. "How long did this take you?" "A few evenings." "It's good work, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She registered it and looked at the desk and said, "Get there and get back. The weather's going to turn again by the end of the week." He left in the morning. The ranch continued its rhythms without him. Cal managed the hands. Pete did his work with the occasional gap in concentration that was his particular weakness. Ruth cooked and kept her own counsel, and watched Clara with an expression that Clara couldn't quite read, something between approval and reservation, as if she were holding a verdict that wasn't ready yet. On the second evening after Wyatt left, Caldwell came himself. She heard the horse in the yard and looked out the office window and recognized him by the way he sat a horse, upright, controlled, a man who'd spent enough time on horseback to be comfortable, but not so much that he'd lost the self-consciousness of it. She went to the front door before he knocked. He was standing at the foot of the porch steps. He looked at the door, and then at her, and something shifted in his expression. He'd expected Ruth, she thought, or possibly expected the house to be less attended. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell." "Is Blackthorne here?" "No." He nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. "I'd like to leave a message for him." "You can leave it with me." She kept her hand on the doorframe and did not step back to invite him in. The temperature was dropping with the dark and she could feel it, but she stayed where she was. He took his hat off, which she recognized as a performance of courtesy rather than actual courtesy. I want him to know that my offer is still open. The South Pasture. Fair market value plus 10%, which is more than he'd get from anyone else in this territory. I'll tell him. Caldwell looked at her steadily. You're a smart woman, he said. I mean that as a statement of fact, not a compliment. You understand what's happening here. Tell me what you think is happening, she said. I'd like to hear your version. He tilted his head. Wyatt Blackthorne is a good man with a property that's been mismanaged and is now underdocumented. When the water board makes its decision, and it will make a decision, probably in the spring, he's going to need resources. He doesn't have to fight it. He doesn't have investors. He doesn't have family money. He's got one Philadelphia woman doing his books and a couple of hands who'll leave if they see the writing on the wall. He said all of this with the reasonable tone of a man describing weather. I'm offering him a way out before the hard part. You're describing a problem you're creating, Clara said, and offering to sell him the solution. A pause. Something moved in Caldwell's eyes. Not anger, not quite respect, but the acknowledgement of a person who had been understood. The water board isn't my invention, he said. The 3 members of it who share your interests are, though. She kept her voice level. And the water dispute was filed within 2 weeks of your employee leaving this ranch with documents from its records. That's a notable timeline. Caldwell was still. He was very good at stillness, she noticed. The kind of stillness that was calculated, that was meant to prevent you from seeing what was happening under it. Be careful what you're suggesting, he said quietly. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm describing documents that exist. She looked at him. Everything I just said is on paper, dated paper. He put his hat back on. He looked at her for a long moment from the foot of the porch steps, and she looked back, and she noticed that her hands were not shaking the way they had on Harlan Street 3 weeks ago. She noticed that she was standing in the doorway of a house she'd been asked to be in, on a property she'd spent 3 weeks learning the shape of, and that the ground under her felt the way it had felt the night she unpacked her bag. Not safe, but solid. You're making an enemy, Caldwell said. You made yourself one, she said. I'm just keeping records. He left. She went back inside and stood in the hall for a moment, and then she went to the kitchen because Ruth was there, and because the kitchen was warm, and because she needed both of those things at once. Ruth looked up from the stove without expression. He's gone? Ruth said. Yes. Ruth poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table without being asked. She sat down across from it, which was an invitation, and Clara sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup. He came here 4 years ago, Ruth said, after Wyatt's wife died. Made an offer on the ranch then, too. She stirred something on the stove. Wyatt threw him off the property, literally off, picked him up by the coat, and set him outside the gate and told him if he came back he'd do it in front of the sheriff. Clara absorbed this. What happened? Caldwell went away and got more patient. Ruth tapped the spoon on the edge of the pot. Patient is worse. A man who's angry makes mistakes. A man who waits looks for the right angle. She looked at Clara. He waited until the books were in bad shape, and the right man was in position to take documents. Then he moved. Henderson, Clara said. Henderson was a drinker and a fool. Caldwell found him in the saloon and bought him enough drinks over enough months to become his employer without Henderson quite realizing when it happened. Ruth said this without evident emotion. I saw it happening and didn't know what to say about it. You don't walk into a man's house and tell him one of his employees is being turned. You could have told Wyatt. I did, in the end. Too late. Ruth sat down heavily. He doesn't listen until he can see the whole shape of something. He's like that. Once he sees it, he acts. But he needs to see it first. Clara looked at her coffee. She thought about the timeline she'd built, the dates that lined up in ways that weren't coincidence. She thought about Caldwell on the porch steps, hat in hand, describing the end of the ranch in reasonable tones. She thought about Wyatt in Billings, sitting across a desk from a lawyer, showing him papers she had organized. He sees it now, she said. Ruth looked at her. The expression that had been somewhere between approval and reservation was still there, but the balance had shifted. Yes, Ruth said. He does. Outside, the wind came in from the northwest the way it did every evening, steady and indifferent and cold, and the ranch held against it the way it always had. Not easily, not perfectly, but with the accumulated stubbornness of 3 decades and the kind of rootedness that took a long time to build, and Clara was beginning to understand a long time to destroy. She sat at Ruth's kitchen table and drank her coffee while it was hot, and she thought about what came next, and she thought about what she knew and what she still needed to know, and she thought about Caldwell's face when she'd said the words dated paper, that flicker of recalculation behind the stillness. He would move again. She was certain of it. A man like that didn't come to a porch himself unless he was gauging something, the strength of the position, the nature of the obstacle. And she understood, sitting in Ruth's kitchen with the wind outside, that she had just been assessed and that the assessment had not gone the way he'd expected, which meant he would adjust. And she would need to be ready when he did. She set the cup down. She said goodnight to Ruth. She went upstairs to the small room that was no longer entirely provisional and sat at the window for a while, watching the dark over the land. Tomorrow she would write down everything Caldwell had said on the porch, every word she could remember, in order, with the date and time and circumstances. She would add it to the folder. She would keep building the record, because records were the thing that outlasted any individual encounter, and because her mother had been right. If you didn't know exactly where you stood, someone else would eventually decide it for you. She was deciding it herself. She went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, and she thought about the iron W on the gate, and she thought, not yet. He hasn't won yet. And she meant Caldwell, but she also meant something else, something older than Caldwell, the version of the thought she'd had standing in an alley between the general store and the leather shop 3 weeks ago, with shaking hands and $63 and nowhere to go. Not yet. Not this. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind kept moving, and the mountains held their snow, and the night went on in the long Montana way, indifferent to small human dramas and entirely indifferent to who won them. Wyatt came back from Billings on a Friday, 4 days after he'd left, arriving in the late afternoon with the wagon heavier than it had gone out. He'd brought back supplies he'd picked up in the city and a leather satchel that he carried separately, not in the wagon bed, which meant the lawyer had given him something worth protecting from the jounce of the road. Clara was in the yard when he came through the gate. She'd been helping Cal restack the woodpile that Pete had restacked badly 3 days ago. Pete's skills with ledgers were developing, his skills with physical tasks remained aspirational, and she straightened up and watched Wyatt pull the wagon in and set the brake. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of a long drive, but the particular tired of a man who'd had several difficult conversations in short succession and hadn't slept well in a strange bed. He came across the yard with the satchel and looked at her and said, "Inside. I'll tell you what he said." She told Cal she was done with the wood. Cal told her the wood was fine, which was his way of saying she hadn't needed to help with it in the first place, which was his way of saying he'd noticed but wasn't going to make a thing of it. She followed Wyatt inside. He set the satchel on the office desk and opened it. The lawyer, a man named Garvey, Wyatt said, who had handled the Blackthorne family's legal matters since his father's time, and who was possessed of a precise and unhurried mind that Wyatt seemed to find both reassuring and maddening, had reviewed everything in the folder and had reached several conclusions. The water rights were solid. The original settlement documentation was clear and predated any of Caldwell's purchases by 3 decades, and while Caldwell's claim was not frivolous, he had filed it correctly and had found a technical gap in how the rights had been transferred when the property passed from Wyatt's father. The gap was closable, and Garvey was already in the process of closing it. That was the good news. The less good news was that 3 of the 4 water board members did in fact have financial relationships with Caldwell, 2 of them through a land company he'd incorporated in Billings the previous year, which was not widely known in Carver's Crossing, and which Garvey had discovered through the kind of patient document work that apparently cost a significant amount per hour. The board was not corrupt in the simple sense of the word, Garvey had explained, but it was arranged in ways that were convenient for Caldwell, and convenience had a way of shaping judgment. He said the board vote is scheduled for February, Wyatt told her. They accelerated the timeline. It was supposed to be May. Clara looked at the papers Garvey had sent back with Wyatt. Someone pushed it forward, she said. Garvey thinks Caldwell did, through the board members he has relationships with. Wyatt sat down heavily in the chair across the desk. Moving the vote to February means we have less time to build the counterfiling. It also means if we lose going into spring, which is when the water matters most. What does Garvey need from us? A formal response to the claim, with all supporting documentation. He has the original settlement papers. He'd kept copies in Billings. But he needs the current operational records, proof that we've been using the water consistently, evidence of the ranch's viability. Wyatt looked at her. And he thinks the missing contracts matter more than I did. If Caldwell used them to establish that our supply management was inconsistent, then he's been building a paper case that you're not making proper use of the resource you're claiming rights to, Clara said. She'd been thinking about this for 4 days. If he can show the board that the South Fork water is being underused or mismanaged on your end, he strengthens his argument that a better managed operation, his operation, should have priority. She set the papers down. The contracts aren't just missing, they're a gap in your record that his narrative fills. Wyatt was looking at her with the attention he reserved for things he was genuinely thinking about, not performing attention for. You worked that out before I got back, he said. I had 4 days. He almost smiled. Not quite. Garvey said the same thing, more or less. He said we need to produce either the contracts or a credible alternative record of the supply arrangements. He paused, and he said something else. She waited. He said if we knew who Henderson had given the contracts to, and if we could prove they were removed deliberately rather than lost, it changes the nature of the dispute. It stops being a water rights case and starts being a fraud case. Wyatt's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, the same deliberate settling she'd seen in the yard when Caldwell's man came. A different kind of legal problem for a different kind of court. Can we prove it? Not yet. She picked up the pen from the desk and the notebook she'd been keeping since Caldwell's evening visit. Everything she could remember, dated, in order, and set them beside Garvey's papers. I wrote down everything Caldwell said on the porch, the exact words. The timeline I showed you before you left, and this. She tapped the notebook. It's not proof of the contracts, conduct. Wyatt looked at the notebook. He picked it up and read through it with the same unhurried attention he gave to the accounts, following each page to the bottom before turning it. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. He came here while I was gone, he said. Not a question. Yes. He knew I was in Billings. I assumed so. He nodded slowly. He was testing the position, seeing if you'd... He stopped. He looked at her. He thought you'd be easier to move without me here. He thought I had reasons to want an easier situation, Clara said. He wasn't entirely wrong about my situation. He was wrong about what I'd do about it. Wyatt said nothing for a moment. Outside, Pete was doing something in the yard that involved dropping something heavy and then saying something that Clara had learned in 3 weeks to simply not hear. Wyatt looked at the papers on the desk, at the notebook, at the folder she'd prepared, and then he looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately have a word for, something direct and a little uncomfortable, the expression of a man acknowledging a thing he'd been slow to see. I didn't hire you expecting this, he said. I know. I hired you for 4 days of bookkeeping. I know that too. He picked up the notebook again and set it on top of the folder. Garvey's going to want all of this. The timeline, your notes from Caldwell's visit, the full accounts. He paused. He's also going to want to talk to you. He said, when I described the situation, he said the person keeping the records was as important as the records themselves. That in a fraud case, you need someone who can testify to the chain of custody, how the documents were found, what condition they were in, what was missing, and when the absence was noted. The word testify sat in the room between them. If it comes to that, Clara said carefully, I'll do it. It may come to that. Then I'll do it. She said it without drama. He nodded, receiving it the same way. Ruth appeared in the office doorway. Food, she said. They ate. The meal was quieter than usual, Pete subdued in the way he got when he sensed something serious had happened but didn't know what. Cal absent because he'd already eaten, Ruth moving between stove and table with her customary efficiency. Clara ate and thought, and Wyatt ate and thought, and the two of them thinking in the same room had a companionable quality she'd come to recognize over the past weeks. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people whose thoughts were running alongside each other. After the meal, she cleared the table and Ruth washed up, and Clara went back to the office and began preparing the documents Garvey would need, working by lamplight until the oil was low. She went to bed late and woke early, as she always did, and by the time the rest of the household was moving, she had the initial summary drafted and the documents in the order she wanted them. The week that followed established a different rhythm, faster, more purposeful, with a specific deadline giving shape to the days. She worked on the legal preparation in the mornings. She kept up the household accounts in the afternoons. Wyatt rode out to his neighboring ranchers twice during the week and came back both times with the look of a man who'd had useful conversations, which she understood meant he was building the kind of support that didn't show up in documents but mattered when documents weren't enough. On Thursday, the stage from Billings arrived in Carver's Crossing carrying ordinary cargo and one passenger. Wyatt got the news from Pete, who'd been in town for supplies. He came back with the wagon and told them at the dinner table, and Clara watched Wyatt's face do something she hadn't seen before. Not quite surprise, because the surprise was too complicated to be simple, but a rearrangement, the way a face looks when something long held in a fixed position suddenly shifts. "Vivian," he said, quietly, as if he was confirming it to himself. "That's what they said at the post office," Pete confirmed. "Vivian Blackthorne. Stage came in at 2. Ruth set down her fork. She looked at Wyatt with an expression that held 6 months of unspoken opinion in it. "I'll make up the south room," she said. "She'll come out tomorrow," Wyatt said. "Or she'll send word." "She'll come out tonight," Ruth said, with the certainty of someone who knew the person in question. "She's been on a stage from Billings all day. She's not sitting in that boarding house overnight when she can be here." Vivian Blackthorne arrived at 7:30 in a hired wagon driven by a man from town who turned around immediately and went back, clearly having been paid for speed rather than courtesy. She came through the door with a large trunk that she carried one end of herself. The driver had helped her get it off the wagon and then left, and she and Pete wrestled it up the porch steps with the cheerful pragmatism of someone who'd done worse. She was Wyatt's sister. She was 32, Clara would later learn, and she had been in San Francisco for 4 years, which explained the coat and the way she moved. Not like a Montana woman, not exactly, but like a woman who had been a Montana woman and then spent 4 years in a city and was wearing the city's habits lightly on top of the original ones. She had dark hair like Wyatt's, going slightly toward curl at the ends, and her face had the same basic geometry as his, square jaw, direct eyes, on a different arrangement. She stopped in the hall and looked at Clara with the frank assessment of someone who didn't soften her first reactions and had decided long ago that this was a feature rather than a flaw. "You're not Ruth," Vivian said. "Clara Whitmore. I'm managing the household accounts." "From Philadelphia." It wasn't a question. Clara didn't know how she knew, but she clearly knew. "Wyatt wrote to me about a woman from Philadelphia. Not much, but Wyatt never writes much." "No," Clara agreed. Vivian looked around the hall, at the house as it was now versus however she held it in her memory, doing that particular arithmetic of returned travelers. "Where's my brother?" He appeared from the office. They looked at each other across the hall in the loaded way of siblings who have not been in the same room for a long time and have accumulated in the interim. Then Vivian crossed to him and hugged him. Quickly, firmly, the hug of practical people, and stepped back and held him at arm's length and examined his face the way doctors examine things. "You look tired," she said. "I've been occupied." "You look like you've been alone too long." She said it without accusation, just as a report. She let go of his arms and looked back at Clara. "How bad is it? The Caldwell situation." "How much do you know?" Wyatt said. "I know what Garvey's clerk told me when I went to see him in Billings, which is that my brother has a water rights problem, and a missing documents problem, and a man making moves on the ranch from the south." She said all of this as one might say the weather was cold. "Garvey didn't tell me that himself. He's very proper about client confidentiality, but his clerk is 22 and likes to talk." Wyatt sat down on the hall bench that had been there since their childhood and looked at his sister. "Why did you come?" Vivian looked at him as though it were a strange question. "Because you're in trouble and you're my family." She picked up one end of the trunk. "And because I have something you need. Help me with this." They got the trunk into the south room. Clara, who had been in the hall through this whole exchange, went to make tea because it was something to do, and because she had the sense of a family dynamic recalibrating itself around her, and she wanted to give it room. When Vivian came to the kitchen half an hour later, Clara had the tea on the table. Wyatt was there. Ruth had removed herself with the tact of someone who understood when fewer people in a room was better. Vivian sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at Clara with the direct examination she'd used in the hall. Wyatt says you built the timeline, she said. The connections between Henderson and Caldwell and the missing contracts. It wasn't complicated, Clara said. The dates lined up. Anyone would have seen it. Anyone who was looking, Vivian said. Most people aren't. Most people look at what they expect to see. She drank her tea. Caldwell and my family go back further than this water dispute. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Clara looked at Vivian. Our father had a partnership with him, Vivian said. Briefly. 1871. They were going to run cattle jointly on the South Range, split costs and profits. It fell apart within a year. She held her cup with both hands. Caldwell's version was that my father was a poor businessman. Our father's version was that Caldwell had structured the agreement so that he could dissolve it on terms that were favorable to himself and had intended to from the beginning. Was that true? Clara said. We never had the documents to prove it, Vivian said. My father let it go rather than fight it in court. It cost him 2 years of profit and his relationship with 2 men who'd sided with Caldwell in the dispute, and it took him 10 years to rebuild what he lost. She paused. I've been trying to find those original partnership documents for the last 6 months. In San Francisco, where Caldwell incorporated his first land company in '68. I found something. She looked at Wyatt. He looked at her. Tell me, he said. The original land company, the one from '68 before he came to Montana, was dissolved under a fraud investigation. He wasn't charged. The documentation from the investigation was sealed. But the dissolution agreement had a signatory list, and one of the signatories was a lawyer named Marsh, who now practices in Helena. Vivian set down her cup. Marsh prepared the original partnership agreement between Caldwell and our father in 1871. The same man. Clara was very still. Marsh prepared the agreement that Caldwell used to take money from your father, she said, and Marsh is in Helena. Marsh prepared documents for Caldwell consistently from '68 to the mid-'70s, Vivian said. Then the relationship apparently ended. I don't know why. But what it means is that there is a pattern, a documented pattern, of Caldwell entering into agreements that are structured to benefit him at the other party's expense. And those agreements were prepared by the same lawyer over a period of years. Wyatt was looking at the table. Clara could see him assembling this, fitting it against what he already knew. Garvey needs this, he said. Garvey needs the San Francisco dissolution documents, the signatory list, and Marsh's name connected to both the '68 company and the '71 partnership. Vivian reached into her coat pocket and set a folded envelope on the table. I had a copy made in Billings. The originals are with Garvey's office now. I dropped them before I got on the stage. Clara looked at the envelope. She thought about the timeline she'd built in the office, the dates that lined up. And now behind those dates, further back, another layer of the same pattern, the same methods, a history that Caldwell had been able to keep buried because nobody had looked far enough or in the right cities. He's done this before, Clara said. Not just with your father, multiple times. At least twice that I can document, Vivian said, possibly more. If the water board sees that, Clara said slowly, it changes what his claim looks like. It's not a land dispute anymore. It's a pattern of behavior. That's what I thought, Vivian said. She looked at Clara with something that had moved past assessment into a different register. Garvey said the same thing. He said what I brought him was context. That context doesn't prove the current case, but it changes how the judge reads it. And the board members with financial relationships to Caldwell, Wyatt said. If they're connected to a man who has a history with the courts in San Francisco, they may reconsider the speed at which they want to be associated with his claim, Vivian said. Yes. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, pressing in from every direction, indifferent and thorough. There's still the February vote, Clara said, and we still don't have the original contracts that Henderson took. No, Vivian agreed. We don't. Henderson is working for Caldwell now, Wyatt said, at his southern property. Do you know what he's doing there? Ranch work, I assume. Wyatt frowned. I don't know exactly. Clara thought about Henderson, a man she'd never met, who existed in her mind as the negative space in a ledger, the absence of documents, the decisions that had been made before she arrived. A drinker and a fool, Ruth had said. A man who'd been bought with enough drinks over enough months that he hadn't quite noticed when the buying was complete. People who make poor decisions under one set of circumstances, Clara said carefully, sometimes make different decisions under different ones. She looked at Wyatt. If Henderson understood that the documents he took are now part of a pattern that goes back to San Francisco, if someone explained to him what he's actually involved in, he'd have to be willing to hear it, Wyatt said. He'd have to be scared enough, Vivian said. She looked at her brother. I'm not saying approach him. I'm saying if the picture got larger in ways he didn't expect, a man in his position might reconsider his options. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. Clara watched him and let him think. This was something she'd learned, not to fill his silences, because his silences were working silences, and interrupting them was like stepping in front of a moving thing. Garvey first, he said finally. Everything Vivian brought, the timeline, the notes on Caldwell's visit, all of it. Garvey files the counter-response this week. He looked at his sister. How long can you stay? As long as it takes, Vivian said. She said it simply, as a statement of fact, and Clara thought that the simplicity of it was the most moving thing she'd heard in several weeks. Not a dramatic declaration, just a sister telling her brother she wasn't leaving. Wyatt looked at the table. He nodded once. They sat at the kitchen table while the night went on outside, the three of them and the papers and the accumulated weight of what they knew, which was more now than it had been a week ago, and what they needed to do, which was clearer now than it had been a week ago. Clara thought about the night she'd arrived in Carver's Crossing, the $63, the stagecoach pulling away. She thought about standing in that alley with shaking hands, counting boards. She thought about the water rights notice at the back of the second ledger, which she'd found because she was thorough, and the timeline she'd built because she'd had 4 days in a quiet office, and the note she'd written the night Caldwell stood at the foot of the porch steps and told her she was making an enemy. She thought about all of it as a chain, each thing leading to the next, each small decision accumulating into a shape she couldn't have planned from the beginning because she hadn't known the beginning well enough. You didn't plan for a life like this. You just kept making the next right decision, and then the one after that, and trusted that the accumulation was building something, even when you couldn't see what. I'll make up fresh copies of the timeline for Garvey's files, she said. With Vivian's information added, he should have a complete version. In the morning, Wyatt said. In the morning, she agreed. Vivian looked between the two of them with the expression of someone who had arrived expecting to help with something and found it further along than anticipated. She looked at Clara for a moment, a specific look, the kind that meant she was filing something away for later. She said nothing about it. She finished her tea and took her cup to the basin and said goodnight and went to the south room, and Clara heard her moving around in there while she washed her own cup and set it in the rack, the sounds of someone unpacking for a stay of indeterminate length. Clara went upstairs to the small room. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window, at the darkness outside it, at the faint outline of the mountains that you couldn't see in the dark but knew were there. Tomorrow she would write clean copies of everything. Tomorrow. Wyatt would send an express letter to Garvey with the new information. Tomorrow they would begin the next phase of whatever this was, and the phase after that, and on through February, and whatever February brought. But right now it was Thursday night, and the house was warm, and there were 3 people in it who understood the shape of what they were up against, which was a different position than the ranch had been in a month ago, and different again from where she had been the afternoon she'd stood in an alley on Harlan Street and counted boards to stop her hands from shaking. She lay down without undressing. She was tired in the way that came from doing necessary things rather than from doing nothing, and there was a difference between those two kinds of tired that she had come to value. She thought about Vivian saying, "As long as it takes." 3 words, nothing remarkable about them, and yet she had felt them land somewhere in her chest and stay. She thought about what it meant that she had felt that, what it said about what she'd been missing, how long she'd been missing it, and what it might mean that she'd found something like it here, in this cold, drafty house, at the end of a long, bad month, in a place she'd never intended to stay. She closed her eyes. The ranch made its nighttime sounds around her, timber and wind and the far-off settling of animals, and she let them be what they were, which was the sounds of a place that was still standing and intended to keep standing and had more going for it now than it had yesterday. That was enough. For tonight, That was exactly enough. The clean copies took Clara the better part of Friday morning. She wrote them out by hand, 2 full sets, everything organized chronologically, with Vivian's San Francisco material integrated into the timeline so that the pattern showed itself the way it actually existed. Not as separate incidents, but as a method, practiced and refined over 15 years, wearing different faces in different territories, but recognizable once you saw it whole. Vivian sat with her in the office for part of the morning, reading back through the original documents while Clara wrote, occasionally saying something that helped Clara refine a connection she'd made tentatively. They worked without much conversation, which Clara appreciated. Vivian had the same quality as her brother in that way. She didn't fill space with noise. She occupied it. At one point, Vivian said, without looking up from the papers, "You do this quickly. I've had practice. Wyatt said your mother kept a shop for 22 years, and you kept the books. From when I was old enough to be trusted with them." Clara didn't stop writing. She was particular about accuracy. She said a number that was approximately right was wrong. Vivian looked up then. Something in her expression that was neither pity nor approval, but somewhere between them. Recognition, maybe. "My mother was the same way about everything," she said. "About the land, the cattle counts, the fencing records. She said the ranch would only stay ours as long as we knew it better than anyone who wanted to take it." Clara set down her pen for a moment. "She was right." "She was right about most things," Vivian said. "She would have liked you." She said it simply, not as flattery, and went back to her reading. Clara picked up her pen and kept writing. By early afternoon, both sets were complete. Wyatt sent Pete into town with an express letter for Garvey, one copy of the full timeline enclosed, with a note in Wyatt's plain handwriting explaining the new material and asking Garvey to proceed with the counterfiling immediately. The second copy went into the locked box in the office that Clara had established in the first week, where the most critical documents lived. The waiting that followed was its own kind of weather. January moved through the ranch in the way January moves through Montana. Slowly, with a thoroughness that made you understand why people who'd spent summers here still sometimes didn't survive their first full winter. The cold was not dramatic. It was simply present, in the walls and the ground and the air, a constant against which all other activity was conducted. The cattle needed more feed. The horses needed checking every morning. The south fence had a section that kept working loose in the freeze-thaw cycles, and Cal fixed it 3 times in 2 weeks before he found the underlying problem and fixed that instead. Clara learned to wear an extra layer without thinking about it. She learned the particular rhythm of a ranch in winter, which was different from autumn. Slower in some ways, more inward, the days shorter and the work concentrated differently. She also learned things about Wyatt that she hadn't known in the warmer, more outward-facing weeks of October. That he read in the evenings, mostly practical things but occasionally history, and that he had opinions about what he read that he'd share if asked, but not otherwise. That he checked on his horses personally every night before he slept, not because he didn't trust his hands, but because he needed to see them himself. That he was harder on Pete than Pete's failures warranted, and that he knew it, and that this knowledge didn't fully correct the pattern, but softened it in ways Pete probably didn't notice, but Clara did. She learned that he'd loved his wife in a way that had left a specific shape in how he moved through the house. There were rooms he didn't go into casually, a particular chair that stayed empty at the table, not because anyone had decided it should, but because no one sat in it, a habit of quiet on certain evenings that had the texture of something old and grief-adjacent. She didn't mention any of this. Some things were information and not conversation. What she and Wyatt did talk about, in the evenings when the work was done and the house was settled, was the situation, Garvey's progress, the February timeline, what they knew and what they were still waiting to know. These conversations were practical but had the quality of something else underneath them, a regular return to the same space that had less to do with the content each time and more to do with the habit of it. Vivian noticed. She didn't say anything about it directly, which Clara appreciated. She said one evening when it was just the two of them in the kitchen after Wyatt had gone to check the horses. "He's been better since you got here." "I sort his papers," Clara said. Vivian looked at her with the expression of a woman who found deliberate obtuseness slightly amusing. "Yes," she said. "That must be it." The letter from Garvey came in the 3rd week of January. Wyatt read it at the table, folded it, looked at the middle distance for a moment, then passed it to Clara without comment. She read it. Vivian, who was across the table, waited. Garvey had filed the counter-response. The water rights documentation had been formally submitted with the original settlement papers and a full accounting of the ranch's water use going back 10 years, reconstructed from the records Clara had organized. The San Francisco material had been reviewed by a colleague of Garvey's with experience in corporate fraud, who had confirmed that the pattern Vivian identified was legally significant, not sufficient on its own to invalidate Caldwell's current claim, but sufficient to constitute what Garvey called a material pattern of conduct, which a judge could take into account when evaluating the claim's merit. More importantly, Garvey had reached out, through careful channels, to the fourth water board member, the one who did not have a financial relationship with Caldwell. His name was Orson Tate, and he was a rancher from the north end of the valley who had served on the board for 12 years and who had, Garvey's letter indicated, been uncomfortable with the accelerated timeline from the beginning but had been outvoted 3-1. Tate had agreed to meet with Garvey. Tate, Wyatt said when Clara finished reading. I know him, older man. He was friends with my father. Does he know the San Francisco history? Clara said. He may know some of it, not the documented version. Wyatt looked at Vivian. What Garvey's showing him. We'll tell him what Caldwell is, Vivian said, not just what he's doing now. The meeting between Garvey and Tate happened the following week. The letter reporting on it arrived 4 days later and was shorter than the first. Garvey was a lawyer and didn't use words he didn't need. But what it said was clear enough. Tate had reviewed the material. Tate had asked several careful questions. Tate had said he would need to make his own inquiries before the February meeting. 2 days after that letter arrived, Henderson came to the ranch. Clara was in the office when she heard the horse, and she went to the window and saw a man she didn't recognize at the gate, sitting on a horse that was thin in the way horses get when they're not getting enough winter feed. The man himself was thin in the same way. She went to find Wyatt. He came out to the porch and stood at the top of the steps and looked at the man at the gate. A long pause. Henderson, he said. His voice was flat. Henderson got off his horse and led it through the gate. He was perhaps 50, though circumstances had added years to him that weren't strictly chronological. A man who had made a series of decisions and was currently living in their aftermath. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Wyatt with the expression of a person who has rehearsed something many times and now that the moment has arrived cannot find the beginning of it. I heard you filed with the water board, Henderson said. I did. Caldwell knows. Henderson stopped. He looked at the horse's neck. He let 2 of his men go last week and didn't pay them their full wages. He told me it was temporary. It's not temporary. He looked up. He's pulling money into the legal fight and cutting everything else. Wyatt said nothing. He waited. I still have those contracts, Henderson said. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Clara, standing in the doorway behind Wyatt, felt it. Where? Wyatt said. In my gear. I kept them. Henderson said it with the particular shame of a man admitting something he's been carrying. I didn't know what I was doing when I took them. That's not... I knew what I was doing. I just didn't understand what it was part of. He stopped. He told me you were going under anyway, that the water claim was just the formal piece and the rest was already decided. He said I was taking documents from a failing operation and it didn't matter. He looked at Wyatt. He said a lot of things. He does, Wyatt said. I heard about the San Francisco company. Henderson's voice was unsteady. Caldwell's man told me, accidentally I think, that things were getting complicated on the legal side. I asked around. Man at the feed store in Caldwell's town mentioned a fraud case. Old one, from California. He swallowed. I'm not a complicated man, Mr. Blackthorne. I know what I did, and I know it was wrong, and I know saying that now doesn't fix the wrong. He reached into his coat and brought out an envelope, folded and worn at the edges, and held it out. 4 contracts, June and July. Your supplier signatures are on them. Wyatt came down the porch steps and took the envelope. He opened it and looked at what was inside without expression, then folded it closed. Come inside, he said. You'll need to write a statement. Henderson looked like a man who had expected a different reception and was not sure whether the actual one was better or worse. All right, he said. What followed was 2 hours at the kitchen table with Henderson, Wyatt, and Clara, during which Henderson told everything he knew. Not just the contracts, but the conversations he'd had with Caldwell over the months of his gradual recruitment, the things Caldwell had said about the water board and the land company and his plans for the valley. And Henderson put it all into a written statement that Clara drafted carefully, and Henderson signed at the bottom with a hand that shook slightly but completed the job. Vivian sat in the corner and read through the contracts while this happened. When Henderson was done, she looked up and said, "The signatures match the supplier records. These are genuine." Henderson looked at his hands on the table. He looked like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the shape of it. Finally, he said, to no one in particular, he said nobody would be hurt. He kept saying it was just business. "It's always just business," Vivian said without particular heat, "until it's your business." They fed Henderson because it was dinner time, and because the horse needed water and feed, and because Ruth, without being asked, had set an extra place with the quiet authority of a woman who made these decisions herself. Henderson ate without talking much and left in the early dark, heading back toward Caldwell's property. He still had his room there, he said, until he could arrange otherwise. And they watched him go from the porch. "He'll tell Caldwell he came here," Cal said. He'd appeared at the edge of the porch with the timing of someone who'd been around long enough to know when things were happening. "I know," Wyatt said. "Let him." Garvey received the contracts and Henderson's signed statement by express on Saturday morning. His response came back the following Wednesday, and it was 3 pages, which for Garvey was the equivalent of another man writing a novel. He had filed the contracts with the court as supplemental documentation. He had shared Henderson's statement with Tate. He had formally requested that the February board meeting be postponed pending a judicial review of the claim's origins. Not a certainty, but a reasonable motion given the new material. He had also, in the final paragraph, noted that 2 of the 3 water board members with financial relationships to Caldwell had contacted him directly in the previous week, requesting clarification on certain aspects of the San Francisco documentation. He did not editorialize on this. He didn't need to. Clara read that paragraph 3 times. "They're looking for an exit," Vivian said, reading over her shoulder. She didn't mean it unkindly. Men like that don't want to be on the wrong side of a fraud case. They want to be on the side that was always skeptical. "Can Garvey use that?" Clara asked. "He already is," Wyatt said. He'd been standing by the window. He turned around and looked at the letter in Clara's hands. "He's giving them the way out. That's what the clarification requests are. They're asking him to confirm that what they know is what there is to know." "And if it is," Clara said, "then they vote against Caldwell in February," Wyatt said, "or they recuse. Either way, the vote goes differently than Caldwell planned." February came in hard and then softened unexpectedly in its second week, the temperature rising enough that the snow on the yard went gray and heavy, and the road into town became negotiable in the way Montana roads sometimes weren't. The board meeting was scheduled for February 14th. Garvey's postponement motion had been denied. The board had voted 3-1 to proceed on the original date, with Tate as the dissenting vote. But what that 3-1 majority looked like now compared to what it had looked like in October was a different thing entirely. Wyatt went to the meeting. He asked Clara to come. She was not sure it was appropriate, and she said so. And he said, "You built the case. You should see what it does." Vivian came too. The 3 of them drove into Carver's Crossing on the morning of the 14th in the wagon, with Garvey traveling separately from his room at the boarding house where he'd arrived 2 days prior to prepare. The water board met in the back room of the county recorder's office, a space that was not designed for an audience but had one anyway. 6 ranchers from the valley, a few townspeople, the county recorder himself sitting in the corner with a ledger. The 4 board members sat at a table at the front. Tate was on the far left, white-haired, watching the room with the patience of a man who had been watching rooms for a long time. The other 3 sat together in a cluster that looked, to Clara's eyes, slightly less cohesive than it once had. Caldwell was there. He sat to the right side of the room with a lawyer she didn't recognize, a younger man, city suit, the look of someone brought in for the occasion rather than invested in the place. Caldwell looked at Wyatt when they came in, and then looked at Clara, and whatever he saw in her face, or in the fact of her presence, made something tighten briefly around his eyes before he returned to neutral. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought about an alley on Harlan Street and a woman counting boards. The meeting ran for 2 hours. Garvey presented the counterfiling with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times and knew which details mattered to which kind of audience. He walked through the water rights history, the settlement documentation, the ranch's consistent use of the South Fork over 3 decades. He presented the contract documentation, the 4 recovered contracts, as evidence of consistent supply management. He presented the Henderson statement not as a character attack, but as a factual account of the circumstances under which documents had left the ranch. And then he presented the San Francisco material. He did it carefully, which was the right way to do it. He didn't call Caldwell a fraud. He presented a pattern. A company dissolved under investigation, a lawyer who appeared in that company's documents, and then appeared again in a partnership agreement that had been structured to the disadvantage of the other party, a method that had been used before and was recognizable now that the documentation existed to show it. He asked the board to consider whether a claim filed by a party with this history deserved the procedural advantages it had been afforded. Caldwell's lawyer objected several times. The board chair, one of the 3 with Caldwell relationships, sustained some objections and overruled others in ways that Clara tracked carefully and that told her the chair was not fully committed to the side he was nominally on. When Garvey finished, Caldwell's lawyer presented the claim. He was competent. He made the case that Caldwell had filed properly, that the water use records showed gaps. He meant the period before Clara arrived, when the books were in Henderson's approximate state, and that his client had a legitimate interest in the resource. He did not address the San Francisco material directly, which was a choice that Clara thought was probably the wrong one. During the break between presentations, Tate caught Wyatt's eye and gave him a nod that communicated nothing specific and everything general. Wyatt received it without expression. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Clara sat in her chair and did not move and did not speak and watched the room. Vivian sat beside her and did the same. At one point, Vivian's hand moved to cover Clara's briefly. A small gesture, there and gone. The kind of thing you do when you're sitting beside someone in a room where waiting is the only available action. The board returned. The chair read the decision in the flat tone of a man delivering a verdict he had been persuaded toward rather than one he had reached himself. The claim filed by Ethan Caldwell on the South Fork water rights of the Blackthorn property was denied. The existing rights documentation was confirmed as valid and current. The board further noted, in language that Garvey had clearly influenced, that the circumstances of the claim's filing would be referred to the county court for review. That last part was the part that mattered most. Not the denial of the claim. That was necessary, but it was defensive. The referral to the county court was forward-facing. It meant Caldwell's conduct didn't end here. It followed him. Caldwell stood up when the decision was read. He didn't say anything. He looked at Wyatt for a moment, and then he looked at Clara, and she looked back. She was thinking about the porch steps, about dated paper, about the way his face had looked when she'd said it. That flicker of recalculation. She was thinking about how long he'd been building this particular structure and how thoroughly it had come apart, and not because of any dramatic confrontation, but because of records. Dates. Numbers. A timeline written in a back office by lamplight, while a Montana winter pressed against the walls. He left without speaking. His lawyer followed. Some of the room exhaled. Wyatt shook Garvey's hand. Garvey said something quietly that Clara couldn't hear. Tate came across the room and shook Wyatt's hand with both of his, and said something that made Wyatt nod, and looked at Clara and said, "Good work, young woman," which was not the most sophisticated acknowledgement she'd ever received, but it was genuine, and she took it as such. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon, the 3 of them in the wagon with the February light going long and flat across the snow-patched land. Nobody talked much. There wasn't much to say yet. The decision was real, but it needed to settle before it became something you could put words around properly. It was Vivian who spoke first, about a mile out from town. "He'll be careful for a while," she said. "Then he'll try something else somewhere else. Men like that don't stop." "No," Wyatt said, "but it won't be here." She looked at the land around them. "He's lost the water, and he's lost the board members, and he's got a court referral attached to his name. He'll find a different valley." "Some other rancher," Wyatt said. His voice had something in it, not satisfaction exactly, which would have been too simple. Something more like the feeling of having done what you could with what you had. Some other rancher who may or may not have someone keeping careful records, Vivian said. The wagon went on. Clara looked at the road ahead and thought about that, about all the ranches and all the valleys where someone was keeping the books in an approximate state, trusting that good faith was enough, not knowing that somewhere a patient man was noting the gaps and planning around them. She thought about her mother's rule. If you didn't know exactly where you stood, someone else would eventually decide it for you. She thought about how many people didn't know where they stood and how costly that ignorance could become. There was no heroism in what she'd done. That was the thing she wanted to be clear about in her own accounting of it. She had not ridden in and saved anyone. She had sat at a desk and read documents and written down what she found and kept doing it. She had refused a man's coins on a public street and then refused to let that refusal be the end of her story. She had been thorough and she had been consistent and she had shown up the next morning and the morning after that, which was the least glamorous form of courage, and also, she had come to believe, the most durable one. The lasting work was always done by the people who kept showing up. In the weeks that followed the board meeting, the ranch settled into a different kind of routine. Not changed, exactly, but confirmed. The water was secure. The books were in good order. Garvey's referral was moving through the county court at the slow pace of legal machinery, and Caldwell had retained a Helena lawyer and was fighting it, but fighting it defensively now, managing exposure rather than advancing a claim. The initiative had shifted. Vivian stayed through February and into March. She said she was thinking about whether San Francisco still made sense for her, and she said it the way people say things they've already decided but want to live with for a little while before announcing. She took over the morning chores with Pete with an energy that Pete found confusing and Clara found entertaining. She argued with Cal about the fencing strategy for the South Range and lost the argument on technical grounds, and then came back 2 days later with a modification that Cal admitted was an improvement. She was, Clara thought, exactly what the ranch had been missing on one side of itself. The restless, outward-facing energy that Wyatt's inward steadiness needed to stay from becoming just stubbornness without context. Ruth, for her part, seemed to sleep better. Clara noticed this over the course of March. Ruth's steps lighter in the mornings, the particular tension she'd carried around the household accounts gone, now that she didn't have to hold them in her head alone. She was 63 years old and had been keeping this household running since before Wyatt's wife died, and she'd done it without complaint, which was not the same as doing it without cost. One afternoon in late March, Clara came into the kitchen and found Ruth sitting at the table with a cup of tea and nothing else to do, which was unusual enough that she looked twice. Ruth looked up. "Sit down," Ruth said. Clara sat down. "You're staying," Ruth said. Not a question. "Through spring, at least," Clara said. "Wyatt asked me." "Not through spring," Ruth said. "Staying." Clara looked at her hands. The scrape on her palm had healed in November and left no mark. "I haven't decided that," she said. "I know you haven't." Ruth drank her tea. "I'm saying you will, because this is where you've put your work, and your work is the kind that makes a place yours." She set the cup down. "My husband's family had a farm in Ohio. I left it when I was 25 because I thought somewhere else was better, somewhere else was fine. But the farm was where I'd put my work." She paused. I understood too late what that meant. Clara looked at the kitchen, at the second shelf above the stove where the blue tin lived, at the window above the basin where the morning light came in, at an angle she'd learned to read for what it said about the weather, at the table with its 4 chairs and the particular grain of the wood that she knew without thinking about it. "I'll think about it," she said. Ruth looked at her with the expression that meant she found deliberate obtuseness slightly less amusing than Vivian did. "All right," she said. The evening in early April when Wyatt asked her to stay was not dramatic. This was something she thought about later and appreciated, that it hadn't been made into something larger than it was, that it had fit the scale of their daily life rather than being lifted out of it. They were in the office. She'd been going over the spring accounts, projecting forward based on the winter's actual costs against what they'd budgeted, because she wanted to know what the margin looked like going into the grazing season now that the water was secure. He came in and sat in the chair across the desk the way he always did when he wanted to talk about something. He said, "Garvey's office wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on document organization for 2 other clients, Valley Ranches. He thinks what you built here is something other operations need." She looked at him. "That's Garvey's question or yours?" He was quiet for a moment. His question first, mine after. He looked at the desk, at the ledgers, the organized files, the system she'd built that could be understood by someone who hadn't built it. Then he looked at her. I want you to stay. Not for the books. The books could be managed. I want you to stay because... He stopped. He was not good at this, and she'd known that for a long time, and she let him find his way without helping. Because the ranch is better with you in it. Because I am. He said it plainly, without decoration. I'm not saying it the way I should probably say it, but I'm saying it. She looked at him across the desk. She thought about the morning 6 months ago when she'd walked north out of Carver's Crossing without a plan, following a road because it was away from a man who'd held out coins on a flat palm. She thought about a barn and a horse and a pry bar. She thought about the iron W on the gate and an office in chaos and 4 days of work that had turned into a winter and a legal fight, and the strange accumulation of a life built in a place she'd never intended to stop. She thought about what it cost to say yes to things. She'd been paying that cost in small installments for months. Each morning she'd gotten up and done the next necessary thing, each decision she'd made with the limited information she had at the time. The yes was already in there. It had been building the same way everything else had built, incrementally, without announcement, through the daily work of showing up. I'm not the same woman who got off that stagecoach, she said. I know that. I'm not easy, she said, and meant it. I have opinions about how things should be kept, and I say them. I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong. You already do, he said. I'll want to consult for Garvey's clients, independently. It matters that I have work that's mine. I wouldn't ask you to give that up. She looked at him for a moment longer. He met it the way he always met things, steadily, without performance, without the particular kind of effort that meant a person was being something they weren't. All right, she said. Yes. He nodded once. She thought he might have been holding something in that he let go then, a long breath, a slight settling of the shoulders. He said, Good. And then looked at the ledger she'd been working on as if he wanted to make sure she didn't think he was going to make a scene about it, which she didn't, and she found that she was smiling without quite deciding to. The spring projection, she said. Do you want to go over it? Yes, he said. And they did. What Clara understood, in the months that followed and then in the years, because it became years, the way things do when you stop treating them as temporary, was something she hadn't expected to learn from any of it. She'd expected to learn about ranches, about Montana, about legal documentation and water rights, and the specific texture of hardship in a cold place. She had learned all of those things, but the thing she hadn't expected was simpler and harder to articulate. It was this, that you didn't find your place. You built it. You built it out of work and consistency, and the daily decision to be useful in the space you occupied. And it became yours not because it was given to you or because you were born into it or because someone decided you deserved it. It became yours because you put enough of yourself into it that the two things, you and the place, couldn't be cleanly separated anymore. She had arrived in Carver's Crossing with $63 and a bag she could carry and the accumulated losses of a year that had taken almost everything she'd had. She had been rejected publicly, and she had stood in an alley and shaken and then stopped shaking and kept going. She had kept going in the only way she knew how, by doing the next necessary thing, and then the next, without knowing where it led, trusting only that forward was better than stopped. She had not saved Blackthorn Ranch through any act of particular heroism. She had saved it through accuracy, through showing up at the desk every morning, through writing down what Caldwell said on the porch steps within the hour, while it was still exact in her mind. Through being the kind of person who noted the date on things and kept them in order and believed, in a deep and practical way, that what you documented was what you could defend. Her mother had taught her that. In 22 years behind a counter on Locust Street, keeping books by lamplight after the last customer left, her mother had taught her that the truth was only as durable as its records. She had carried that lesson west without knowing how useful it would be. In the spring, Vivian decided she was staying. She said it over breakfast one morning in April, to no one in particular, as if she were reporting a weather observation. Wyatt passed the bread without comment. Pete said good, with the heartfelt brevity of a boy who had come to rely on her company. Ruth refilled her coffee. Clara looked across the table at her and thought about the night she'd arrived with the trunk, the 4 words, as long as it takes. And then the quiet decision, 3 months later, that the length of time required was indefinitely longer than anyone had initially said. That was how families actually worked, Clara thought, not in dramatic declarations, in the quiet revision of how long you were willing to stay. By summer, the county court had completed its review of Caldwell's conduct. The referral from the water board had produced findings that were not criminal. The threshold for criminal fraud was high, and the evidence, while consistent, was circumstantial in the ways that evidence always was across multiple decades and jurisdictions. But the civil findings were different. A judge in Helena reviewed the San Francisco material and the Henderson statement and the timeline that Clara had built, and wrote an opinion that was measured in its language and damaging in its conclusions. It found that Caldwell had engaged in a pattern of business conduct that fell below the standard of good faith required in contractual and regulatory dealings. It didn't destroy him, but it followed him. It was on record. And in a territory where reputation was credit and credit was survival, record mattered. He sold the southern properties in August. Not all of them, and not cheaply, but he sold the ones closest to Blackthorn land, and the buyers were men who had no relationship with him and no particular interest in his plans for the valley. The valley's shape shifted with those sales. Not dramatically, just enough. Clara heard about it from Cal, who heard it from a man at the feed store in town, which was how most accurate information moved in Carver's Crossing. She was hanging wash on the line when Cal told her, and she finished hanging the wash before she said anything, because there was something about completing the task at hand before turning to the next thing that she'd learned the hard way was important. When she finished, she said, "Good." Cal went back to what he'd been doing. She picked up the empty basket. The morning was warm and the mountains to the west were green on their lower ridges. The snow pulled back to the high country for the summer, and the land spread out in every direction in the way it did here, uncontained, indifferent, enormous. She stood in the yard for a moment and looked at it. She thought about all the things that had happened in this yard over the months. Henderson at the gate with his thin horse, Caldwell's man with his veiled message, Vivian coming in with one end of a trunk and reshaping the household by simply being in it. She thought about the iron W on the gate that she'd walked through for the first time 8 months ago with her bag over her shoulder, not knowing if she'd be there for 4 days or the rest of her life. She was learning, slowly, that there was no way to know those things in advance. You could only know them looking back. The life you were building was always invisible from the beginning. It only became visible in retrospect, the shape of it emerging gradually from the accumulated decisions you'd made when you couldn't see the shape. That was frightening, if you thought about it too directly. She'd found it was better to think about it sideways, to focus on today's accounts, today's fence, today's person who needed what you could offer. The shape would take care of itself if you kept doing the work. She carried the basket back inside. She set it by the door. She went to the office and sat down at the desk that had once been covered in Henderson's chaos and was now something she could navigate with her eyes closed. And she opened the ledger for June and picked up her pen and began to work. Outside, the ranch continued its life around her. Pete crossing the yard toward the barn. Cal's voice somewhere to the south. A horse moving in the corral. The particular sounds of a working place doing what working places do. Wyatt would be back from the South Range by midday. Ruth was in the kitchen. Vivian was somewhere on the property doing something practical, because Vivian was always doing something practical. Clara wrote the date at the top of the page. June 1884. She noted the column headers. She began to enter the numbers that told the story of where the ranch stood, which was a different story than it had been telling a year ago. Not a triumphant story, nothing like that, but an honest one, a viable one. A story about a place that knew what it had and was tending it carefully, which was the best any place could do, and sometimes enough. She had come west with nothing and built something she couldn't have predicted from the wreckage of what she'd lost. That was not the ending she'd written for herself when she folded those letters and put them in the grate. But it was hers, which was the only qualification that had ever finally mattered. She kept writing. The pen moved across the page in her mother's careful hand. She'd never noticed until recently how much her handwriting resembled her mother's. And the numbers told their story, and the morning kept going, and somewhere a door opened and closed, and the ranch breathed around her like something alive, which was exactly what it was.